The rain had been falling for 3 days, a steady, mournful rhythm against the window panes of Covington Hall. It was a sound Seraphina had always found comforting, the gentle weeping of the sky that made the warmth of the library hearth feel like a secret shared between them. But today, the sound was a cold mockery. It mirrored the slow, silent tears tracing paths down her father's hollow cheeks. He sat opposite her, a man she barely recognized. The formidable Lord Covington, whose laughter once filled every corridor, was now a stooped figure, his shoulders slumped in a worn velvet armchair. The teacup in his hand trembled, its delicate porcelain rattling against the saucer with a sound that seemed to echo the fracturing of their world. He had been speaking for what felt like an eternity, his voice a low, broken murmur that struggled to rise above the drumming rain. He spoke of failed investments, of droughts that had ruined their harvests, of lenders who had once been friends and were now circling like vultures. Each word was another stone laid upon Seraphina's chest, making it harder to breathe. She listened, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching a play about some other unfortunate family. Then he finally looked at her. His eyes, once the same vibrant green as her own, were now clouded with shame and despair. "There is no other way, Seraphina," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "It is the only thing that will save us, that will save our name." She already knew what was coming. She had felt it in the oppressive quiet of the house for months. She had seen it in the way the staff avoided her gaze, in the dwindling number of invitations that arrived, in the threadbare patches on the ancestral tapestries. "What is it, Father?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. It sounded foreign in the heavy silence. He flinched, unable to hold her gaze for long. His eyes fell back to the rattling cup. "An arrangement has been made," he said. "A marriage contract." The word hung in the air. Marriage, wow. It was not a surprise. For a woman of her station, marriage was always a transaction. But she had held on to a foolish, youthful dream of at least some affection, some choice in the matter. "With whom?" she asked, the cold dread finally beginning to seep into her bones as chilling her from the inside out. Her father took a shaky breath. "With the Duke of Blackwood." The name struck her like a physical blow. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, a man she had never met, but whose reputation preceded him like a winter storm. He was spoken of in hushed, fearful tones in London drawing rooms. They said he was ruthless, cold, and utterly unforgiving. A recluse who had inherited his vast fortune under grim circumstances and had since multiplied it with a predatory instinct. They said his heart was as cold and hard as the stone of his Gothic manor. He was a phantom, a monster from a cautionary tale told to frighten ambitious lords. And he was the man who would own her. Seraphina felt the air leave her lungs. "You cannot be serious," she said, the words barely a whisper. Her mind raced, searching for some escape, some alternative. "Father, no. Anyone but him. We can sell the rest of the land. We can dismiss the staff. We can live in 2 rooms of this house. I will work. I will do anything." "It is too late for that," he cried, a flash of his old, desperate anger returning. The teacup finally slipped from his grasp, shattering on the stone floor. Brown liquid spread across the worn rug like a dark stain. He did not seem to notice. "The debts are beyond anything you can imagine. We are ruined, Seraphina. Utterly ruined. The Duke's offer is not just generous. It is our only salvation. He will settle every debt, restore our name. In return," his voice broke. "In return, he asked for your hand." "He asked for me," she corrected, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. The detachment was her only shield now. Like a prize mare, a piece of property to complete his collection. She stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. She felt a sudden, violent urge to run, to smash something, to scream until her throat was raw. But she did nothing. She simply stood there, looking down at the man who was her father, the man who was selling her. "I had no choice," he sobbed, his face buried in his hands. "Forgive me, my child, forgive me." Forgiveness was a distant country she could not even imagine visiting. All she felt was a vast, cold emptiness. The love she had for her father was still there, a painful ache behind her ribs. but it was now entangled with the sharp sting of betrayal. She was a sacrifice laid upon the altar of their family name. Her life, her hopes, her very soul were the price of preserving an honor that now felt like a hollow lie. She turned without another word and walked out of the library, leaving her father to weep among the ruins of their life and the shards of a broken teacup. Her bedroom, once a haven of light and comfort, now felt like a cage. The pale yellow wallpaper, the stack of beloved books on her nightstand, the worn armchair where her mother used to read to her, they all belonged to a girl who no longer existed. That girl had died in the library an hour ago. In her place was a stranger, a woman with a title but no future. Lady Seraphina Covington, the future Duchess of Blackwood. The title felt like a brand. She moved with a mechanical, dreamlike slowness. She pulled a large leather trunk from the top of the wardrobe, the motion stiff and unnatural. What does one pack for a life sentence? She walked to her closet, her fingers brushing against the soft silks and delicate laces of her gowns. Gowns for balls she would never attend, for garden parties she would never enjoy. They were the costumes of a life of freedom she had taken for granted. She turned away from them. They were useless now. She packed only the simplest, most practical dresses. Their dark wools and plain cottons, a fitting shroud for her new life. Her hands moved through her jewelry box, pushing aside the few remaining heirlooms. A pearl necklace, a pair of sapphire earrings. They were baubles, trinkets that would soon be overshadowed by the Blackwood jewels. They meant nothing. Her fingers closed around a single familiar object at the bottom of the box. A simple silver locket on a delicate chain. It was slightly tarnished, its surface worn smooth by the touch of her own fingers over the years. She clicked it open. Inside were two miniature portraits, painted with painstaking detail. On the left was her mother, her smile warm and genuine, her eyes full of life. On the right was her father, younger, happier, his arm around his wife, looking at her with an adoration that made Seraphina's heart ache. This was from before her mother's long illness, before the debts began to mount, before her father's spirit had been crushed under the weight of his own failures. This locket was the only thing that felt real. It was the last piece of a life where she was simply Seraphina, loved unconditionally, not a bartered bride, not a solution to a financial crisis, just a daughter. She clutched the locket so tightly the edges dug into her palm. A single hot tear escaped and fell onto the polished silver. She quickly wiped it away. She would not cry. Crying was a luxury she could no longer afford. Tears were for grief, and what she felt was far colder, far harder than that. It was a resolve, as brittle as ice, forming around her heart. She fastened the chain around her neck, tucking the locket beneath the collar of her dress. It felt cool against her skin, a small, secret anchor in a turbulent sea. They could take her name, her home, her freedom. But this small piece of silver containing a world of lost love, this they could not have. It was the only part of herself she could take with her. She closed the lid of the trunk. The sound was quiet, but to Seraphina, it echoed with the finality of a closing coffin. The journey to Blackwood Manor took 2 days. She sat alone in the carriage, watching the familiar, gentle countryside of her home give way to something wilder and more forbidding. The rolling green hills were replaced by dense, dark forests and rugged, stony moors. The sky seemed to press down, a heavy blanket of gray. The trees grew taller, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching for the carriage. They seemed to whisper warnings she could not understand. She did not read. She did not sleep. She simply stared out the window, the silver locket a cold, constant weight against her chest. When she finally saw it, the manor rose from the mist like a jagged peak. It was not a home, it was a fortress. Blackwood Manor was an imposing Gothic revival mansion, a beast of dark gray stone and sharp angles. Its spires and turrets clawed at the sky, seeming to challenge the heavens themselves. Dozens of windows stared out like vacant eyes, reflecting the bleak landscape. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air settled deep within her. This was not a place of warmth or life. It was a tomb, polished and grand, but a tomb nonetheless. The carriage rolled up the long, winding drive, the crunch of gravel under the wheels the only sound. It stopped before a set of massive oak doors, each one bound with black iron. For a long moment, nothing happened. Serafina sat frozen, her hand instinctively clutching the hidden locket. This was it, the point of no return. She felt a wild, primal urge to throw open the door and run, to disappear into the dark woods and never look back. But the thought of her father's face, shattered and pleading, kept her rooted to the spot. She had made her choice. She had traded her life for his. Then, with a low groan, one of the great doors swung inward. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was tall and unnervingly still, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun that allowed no stray strands. She wore a pristine black housekeeper's uniform, the fabric so stiff it looked like armor. Her face was a mask of stern formality, her expression unreadable. A footman appeared and opened the carriage door. The cold air rushed in. "Lady Serafina," he said, his voice respectful but distant. She took a breath and forced herself to move. She descended the steps, her simple traveling cloak feeling flimsy and inadequate before the overwhelming presence of the manor. As she approached the entrance, the woman in black inclined her head slightly. It was not a bow, but a brief, sharp acknowledgement. "Lady Serafina," the woman said, her voice as crisp and cold as the air. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. We have been expecting you." There was no welcome in her tone, no sympathy. It was a simple statement of fact. Serafina was an expected delivery, and she had arrived on schedule. Mrs. Gable stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Serafina hesitated for a fraction of a second on the threshold, a lone figure caught between the dying light of the outside world and the deep shadows of the hall within. Then, with her head held high, she stepped across it. The doors closed behind her with a heavy, booming thud that echoed through the cavernous space. The sound was utterly final. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock. She found herself in a vast, echoing foyer. The floor was a checkerboard of black and white marble, so polished it reflected the vaulted ceiling high above, like a dark, distorted mirror. Her own small reflection stared back at her, lost and pale. The walls were paneled in wood so dark it was almost black, and from them, generations of Beaumonts looked down from enormous, gilded frames. Their painted eyes were cold and judging, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and disdain. They seemed to be assessing her, weighing her and finding her wanting. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of beeswax and old money. Every sound was magnified. The soft scuff of her own boots on the marble, the rustle of her cloak, the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. It was a silence so profound it felt like a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. There were no flowers to greet her, no crackling fire in the massive, unlit hearth. There was only stone, wood, and shadow. Mrs. Gable stood a few paces away, her hands clasped, her posture rigid, waiting. Serafina's luggage was being brought in, the trunks looking small and insignificant in the immense hall. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. She was a ghost in this house already, an unwelcome specter in a place that had no life to give. The Duke was not here to greet her. She was not a bride to be welcomed, but a possession to be catalogued and stored. She slowly lowered her gaze from the judging eyes of the portraits and stared at her own faint reflection in the marble floor. The proud, defiant girl who had packed her trunk was gone. The resilient daughter who had made a terrible sacrifice was fading. And all that was left was a small, trembling figure, swallowed by the cold grandeur of her new prison. Standing in the cold, echoing foyer of Blackwood Manor, Serafina had never felt more alone. The silence of Blackwood Manor was not an absence of sound, it was a presence. It had weight and texture, pressing in on Serafina from all sides. It was in the funereal tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second a tiny hammer striking the coffin of her old life. It was in the way her own soft footsteps echoed on the polished marble floors, an unwelcome intrusion in a house that seemed to be holding its breath. For 3 days she had been a ghost in this mausoleum, attended to by silent servants who moved like shadows, and a housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, whose lips were permanently pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Serafina had a suite of rooms larger than her family's entire drawing room, furnished with comb, perfect antiques that had witnessed generations of Beaumonts live and die. She felt the eyes of the ancestral portraits that lined the corridors follow her, their painted gazes stern and judging. They knew she did not belong. They knew she was an acquisition, a debt settled in flesh and blood. Her father's tear-streaked face was a constant image behind her eyes. His broken words, "There was no other way, Serafina," were a hollow echo in her heart. She understood duty. She had been raised on it, but this felt like being buried alive. The Duke of Blackwood, her supposed fiancé, remained an abstraction, a fearsome name whispered in society with a mixture of awe and terror. He had not yet shown his face, content to let his vast, empty house serve as her gilded cage. On the fourth morning, Serafina woke to the same oppressive stillness. The pale morning light filtered through the heavy brocade curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She couldn't breathe. The damask wallpaper felt like it was closing in. Her fingers, thin and pale against the dark wood of the windowsill, trembled slightly. She needed air. She needed life. Without a second thought, without ringing for a maid or considering the propriety of it, she dressed herself in a simple day dress. She did not bother with the intricate hairstyles the lady's maid had attempted to teach her. Instead, she quickly braided her fiery auburn hair, loose strands already escaping to frame her face. Clutching the cool, familiar shape of the silver locket around her neck, she slipped out of her room. The manor was quiet, asleep in the early morning sun. She moved down the grand staircase, a trespasser in her own future home. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and something else, something ancient and untouched. She pushed open a heavy side door and stepped out into the grounds. The sudden kiss of cool, damp air on her skin was a shock, a glorious relief. The world outside the manor walls was alive. Dew clung to the impossibly green lawn, sparkling like a carpet of diamonds. The scent of wet earth and distant roses filled her lungs. For a moment, she just stood there, drinking it all in. This was real. This was not the preserved, airless perfection of the house. Following a gravel path that curved away from the manicured gardens, she walked without a destination, simply moving away from the suffocating grandeur behind her. The path led her past a formal rose garden, its blooms too perfect, too regimented, and then sloped downward toward a cluster of buildings she hadn't noticed from her window. They were made of dark stone and rich, weathered timber, nestled under the shade of ancient oak trees. As she drew closer, a new set of smells replaced the cloying sweetness of the roses. The warm, earthy scent of hay, the rich tang of leather, and the unmistakable living scent of horses. The stables. A wave of nostalgia washed over her. Back home, before the debts had mounted, the stables had been her sanctuary. She had spent countless hours with her gentle mare, Lyra, telling the horse secrets she would never tell a soul. Lyra was gone now, sold off with everything else of value. The memory was a fresh, sharp pain. Hesitantly, she approached the wide-open stable doors. The interior was dim, a cathedral of shadows and golden light. Shafts of sunlight cut through the dusty air, illuminating the soft shuffling and quiet snorts of the animals within their stalls. It was peaceful, but it was a living peace, not the dead silence of the manor. No one seemed to be around. She stepped inside, her boots silent on the straw-strewn floor. The warmth of the place enveloped her. She walked slowly down the central aisle, peering into the stalls. There were magnificent animals here, powerful hunters and elegant carriage horses, all gleaming with health. Their large, dark eyes watched her with mild curiosity. Then she saw her. In a large stall at the very end of the aisle stood a mare of midnight black, so dark she seemed to absorb the light around her. A single, perfect white star adorned her forehead. The horse was a vision of raw, untamed beauty, but there was a nervous energy thrumming through her. Her ears were pricked, swiveling to catch every sound. Her skin twitched, and she shifted her weight from hoof to hoof, her powerful muscles tense. Serafina felt an immediate, inexplicable pull, a kinship with this beautiful, restless creature. She moved closer to the stall door, her heart aching with a familiar longing. "Hello there," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The mare's head shot up, her eyes, wide and intelligent, fixed on Serafina. They were dark and filled with a wild, wary light. She took a step back, her nostrils flaring as she snorted. a sharp, distrustful sound that echoed in the quiet stable. "It's all right," Serafina murmured, resting her hand on the top of the wooden door. "I won't hurt you." She extended her hand slowly, palm up, a gesture of peace she had used 1,000 times with Lyra. The mare watched the movement with profound suspicion. She tossed her head, her black mane flying, and took another skittish step back, her hooves stamping impatiently on the straw. Her distrust was a physical thing, a barrier between them. Serafina's hand dropped. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, pricked at her. Of course, even here in this place of escape, she was an unwelcome intruder. Even this horse could sense she didn't belong. She was a stranger, an outsider. She felt the familiar sting of tears behind her eyes and turned away, unwilling to let them fall. She would not cry in a stable. She would not cry at all. "She doesn't take to strangers." The voice was low and quiet, but it startled her so much she gasped, whirling around. He was standing just a few feet away, leaning against a post in the shadows. She hadn't heard him approach at all. He seemed to have materialized from the dusty air itself. He was a stable hand, judging by his simple, worn trousers and linen shirt. The sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms dusted with dirt and straw. His dark hair was unruly, falling over his brow, and his face was all sharp angles and shadow. He held a piece of leather tack in his hands, his fingers working at it with a slow, deliberate motion. Serafina's heart was hammering against her ribs, partly from the shock of his sudden appearance, and partly from something else she couldn't name. She felt a blush creep up her neck. She was a lady of the house, and he was a member of the staff. She should be composed, distant, but his presence had a stillness to it that was anything but subservient. "You startled me," she said, her voice coming out a little sharper than she intended. He didn't apologize or look away. He simply straightened up from the post, his movements unhurried. He was taller than she had first thought, with a powerful build that his simple clothes couldn't hide. "My apologies, my lady," he said. The title sounded strange on his lips, almost ironic. His voice was a low rumble, quiet but carrying easily in the cavernous space. He walked past her, his gaze not on her but on the nervous mare in the stall. "Whisper is particular," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. He unlatched the stall door and slipped inside, moving with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing to watch. Serafina expected the horse, Whisper, to shy away, to rear up in protest at his intrusion. Instead, the mare's entire posture changed. The tension seemed to drain from her body. Her ears, which had been pinned back in agitation, softened and swiveled toward him. She let out a low, soft nicker, a sound of greeting. The man, the stable hand, reached out and ran a hand down the mare's sleek black neck. His hands were large and looked calloused, yet his touch was incredibly gentle. He murmured something to the horse, too low for Serafina to hear. Whisper leaned into his touch, her dark eyes closing halfway in contentment. Serafina watched, completely captivated. He had calmed the volatile animal with nothing more than his presence and a quiet word. There was a connection between them, a silent understanding that was both beautiful and baffling. He moved around the horse, checking her legs, his hands sure and confident. He wasn't just doing a mea, he was communicating with the animal on a level Serafina had only ever dreamed of. The stable was no longer empty. It was filled with the powerful, silent conversation between this man and this horse. She felt like an intruder on an intensely private moment. She should leave. She should return to the cold, silent manor and wait for her fate to be delivered on a silver platter. But she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, watching him. He worked without looking at her, seemingly having forgotten she was there. He picked up a brush and began to groom the mare's gleaming coat, his strokes long and even. The rhythmic sound was hypnotic. The air was thick with the scent of hay and horse, and now with the undeniable presence of this quiet, intense man. Who was he? He was no mere groom. There was an authority in his stillness, a deep well of confidence in his every move. Finally, he finished his work. He gave the mare one last pat on the neck and turned to leave the stall. He latched the door securely behind him, and for the first time since their initial exchange, he looked directly at Serafina. His eyes were a startling, piercing blue, the color of a winter sky. They were not the downcast, deferential eyes of a servant. They were direct, intelligent, and unnervingly perceptive. He looked at her as if he could see right through the fine dress, past the title of My Lady, and straight into the lonely, frightened girl huddled inside. He saw her desperation to connect with the horse. He saw her failure, and he saw her fascination as she watched him succeed. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Serafina felt her cheeks grow warm under his steady gaze. Her carefully constructed composure was crumbling. In the manner, she was an object, a title. Here, under the gaze of this stable hand, she felt suddenly intensely visible. She felt like a person. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze, his expression unreadable. It was not challenging, not precisely, nor was it kind. It was assessing. He was taking her a measure, and she had no idea what he found. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt a strange, unfamiliar flutter deep in her stomach, a nervous energy that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with him. She was the future Duchess of Blackwood. He was a man who worked in her stables. The chasm between them was immeasurable. Yet in that single prolonged look, he had crossed it effortlessly. He had reached out and touched the most hidden part of her without ever moving a muscle. Serafina was the first to look away. She dropped her gaze to the straw-covered floor, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt flustered, exposed, and utterly confused. Who was this man who could tame a wild horse with a touch and unravel a lady with a single look? When she dared to glance up again, he was still watching her. A flicker of something she couldn't identify passed through his blue eyes, something that looked almost like understanding. Then it was gone. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that was neither greeting nor farewell. In turn, he walked away down the length of the stable, his broad back straight and his steps silent, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had come. She left the stables with her heart beating a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. The cool evening air did little to calm the flush on her cheeks. Back in the oppressive grandeur of her chambers, the silence was a physical weight. It was a different kind of quiet from the stables. Here, silence was the absence of life, the sound of dust settling on priceless furniture and forgotten dreams. In the stables, silence was alive, filled with the soft shuffle of hooves on straw and the gentle, rhythmic breathing of animals. It was a quiet that held peace, not emptiness. Serafina paced the length of the enormous Persian rug, the silk cool beneath her thin slippers. She replayed the encounter over and over. The stable hand's gaze had been so direct, so unnervingly steady. It was not the insolent stare of a subordinate, nor the fawning, averted gaze she was accustomed to from servants. It was the look of an equal, of someone who saw past the title of lady and looked straight at the person underneath. It was terrifying, and for a reason she could not name, it was utterly compelling. That night, sleep offered little respite. She dreamt of a wild, dark horse with eyes like chips of blue ice, and the feeling of being watched, not with judgment, but with a quiet, searching intensity. The next morning, the manor felt more like a prison than ever before. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to count down the seconds of her gilded confinement. The stern faces of the Beaumont ancestors, captured in oil paint, followed her from the walls with silent disapproval. Mrs. Gable moved through the house like a specter in black, her presence a constant, chilling reminder of her place in this grand, cold machine. Serafina felt a desperate, clawing need for air, for life, for the scent of hay and warm animals. She needed to escape. She told herself it was for the horse. The magnificent, volatile creature, Whisper, had captured her imagination. She was a kindred spirit, a beautiful thing trapped and fighting against its bonds. Serafina had to see her again. The excuse felt thin, even to her own ears, but it was the only one she had. Pulling a simple cloak over her dress, she slipped out a side door, her steps quickening as she moved away from the stone fortress and toward the rustic promise of the stables. The familiar smells greeted her first, a comforting balm to her frayed nerves. Hay, leather, earth, and the warm, living scent of horses. The sounds followed, a gentle symphony of soft knickers and shuffling hooves. Peeking into the main stable block, she saw him, Alec. He was mending a bridle, his head bent over his work, his strong fingers moving with practiced ease. He seemed a part of this place, as natural and sturdy as the old timber beams above his head. He glanced up as she entered, his blue eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. A simple nod of his head was his only greeting before he returned to his task. There was no bowing, no scraping, no my lady. The lack of ceremony was a strange and profound relief. It allowed her to breathe. She walked to Whisper's stall, her hands gripping the wooden door. The mare watched her approach, her ears twitching, her dark eyes wary. Serafina did not try to enter. She simply stood there, speaking to the horse in a low, soothing murmur. She spoke of the weather, of the color of the sky, of anything and nothing. She just filled the space with the sound of a calm voice, hoping to prove she was not a threat. This became her daily ritual. Each afternoon, when the weight of the manor became too much to bear, she would escape to the stables. She would spend an hour or more simply standing by Whisper's stall, her presence becoming a familiar part of the horse's day. Alec was always there, moving through his chores with a quiet efficiency. He rarely spoke to her directly, yet she felt his presence as a constant, steady point in her shifting world. He was a silent witness to her attempts to befriend the wild mare, and his silence felt like a form of permission, a quiet acceptance of her place in his domain. The stables became her sanctuary, the only place in this entire vast estate where a small part of her felt free. One afternoon, nearly a week after her first visit, her patience with Whisper wore thin. The mare would take oats from her flattened palm, but would still flinch and shy away if Serafina tried to stroke her neck. A sigh of frustration escaped her lips. From across the aisle, the sound of leather being mended stopped. She felt his eyes on her before she saw him move. Alex set down his tools and walked over, his footsteps soft on the straw-strewn floor. He stopped beside her, not looking at her, but at the horse. "You smell of the house," he said. His voice was low, a quiet rumble that didn't startle the animals. "Soap and polish. It's foreign to her." He paused, then added, "And you hold your breath just before you touch her. She feels you hesitate." Serafina's own breath caught in her throat. He was right. She was so tense, so afraid of rejection, that the horse could feel it. He opened the stall door and stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't approach Whisper directly, but went about checking her water trough, his calm presence filling the space. The mare watched him, but her body was relaxed. After a moment, he turned to Serafina. "Come," he said softly. It was not a command, but an invitation. She stepped hesitantly into the stall, feeling as though she were crossing a significant threshold. Alex stood beside the mare's shoulder. He held out his hand, palm down, letting Whisper sniff his knuckles before he slowly, gently ran the back of his hand along her powerful neck. The horse closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. "Your turn," he murmured, looking at Serafina. "Slowly, and breathe." She raised a trembling hand, her heart pounding. She was going to fail again. She knew it. Seeing her hesitation, he moved closer. "Like this." He gently took her hand in his. His skin was rough, calloused from work, a stark contrast to the soft, manicured hands of the men she had known. But his touch was surprisingly careful, his grip firm, yet gentle as he guided her arm forward. The warmth of his hand enveloped hers. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it sent a jolt through her entire body. His thumb rested just over her wrist, brushing against the frantic pulse beating there. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He guided her hand, uncurling her tense fingers, until the back of her hand rested against Whisper's velvet nose. The horse snorted, a warm puff of air against her skin, but she did not pull away. Instead, she nudged her nose into Serafina's palm, a silent query for a treat or a scratch. "There." Alex's voice was a low whisper near her ear. "She just needed to know you mean no harm." He held her hand there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, a moment where the only sounds were the horse's soft breath and the frantic thumping of Serafina's own heart. Then he released her. Her hand fell to her side, but she could still feel the ghost of his touch, the warmth and the strength of it. She did not dare look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the horse, her mind reeling. He had not only shown her how to connect with the animal, he had created a connection with her, a silent, powerful bridge built on a single, fleeting touch. From that day on, something shifted between them. The silence was still there, but it was now a comfortable, shared space rather than an empty one. Serafina learned to groom Whisper, the rhythmic pull of the brush through the mare's glossy coat, a soothing meditation. Alec would work nearby, mending tack or polishing saddles. Sometimes he would pass her a curry comb, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second, an electric spark in the dusty, sunlit air. Each time it happened, she felt a flush rise to her cheeks and would focus intently on her work, hoping he hadn't noticed. Their conversations were sparse, brief exchanges spoken in low voices, as if not to disturb the peace of the stables. They were never about themselves or the great house on the hill, or the duke who owned it all. They spoke the language of this place, the language of horses. Her left foreleg is a little warm, he might observe, running a hand down Whisper's leg. Best to just walk her today. And she would nod, grateful for the shared concern. She found herself telling him about the pony she had as a child, a stubborn little creature named Pip. He was more grass than pony, she said one afternoon, a faint smile on her lips. And he would only let me ride him if I brought him a carrot first. A very particular negotiation. Alex stopped his work, leaning against a post to listen. His gaze was focused, intent, as if her small, simple memory was a story of great importance. He didn't offer a story of his own, but his listening was a gift. In her life, people listened in order to reply, to steer the conversation toward their own interests. Alec just listened. He heard her. She learned the names of the other horses. There was Thomas, the big, gentle giant of a gelding, and Ember, a flighty chestnut mare. She learned their personalities, their quirks, their histories, all through Alec's quiet observations. In this small, straw-filled world, she felt a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. Here, she was not a lady of a fallen house, a bride-to-be sold to a monster. Here, she was useful. She was the woman who could calm Whisper. She was the woman who brought Thomas apples. She was a person, not a title or a transaction. One late afternoon, the low sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the stable's high windows, illuminating the dancing dust motes like tiny fairies. The air was warm and thick with the sweet smell of fresh hay. Serafina was finishing grooming Whisper. The mare, now completely at ease in her presence, rested her head on Serafina's shoulder, letting out a soft, contented sigh. The weight was comforting, a gesture of absolute trust and affection. In that moment, a profound and unexpected wave of pure joy washed over Serafina. It was a feeling so foreign, so long absent, that it almost brought tears to her eyes. The heavy cloak of despair she had been wearing for months seemed to lift, if only for an instant. She was not in a cage. She was in a quiet stable, with a beautiful animal who trusted her, bathed in golden light. She was safe. She was, for this one perfect moment, happy. A smile broke across her face. It was not the tight, practiced curve of the lips she used in drawing rooms. It was a genuine, unburdened smile that started deep in her chest and spread across her features, making her green eyes sparkle with light. It was the smile of the girl she used to be, the girl she thought was gone forever. Across the stable aisle, Alec had stopped his work. He was leaning against a wooden beam, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her. He had been watching for some time, his expression unreadable as always. But as her smile bloomed, his intense gaze softened for a fraction of a second. He saw it. He saw the crack in her careful facade, the flicker of pure, unadulterated happiness. He quietly observed the transformation, this small, momentous victory, and filed it away in the silent ledger of his mind. The warmth of that smile lingered on her lips long after she left the stables. It felt foreign, a borrowed garment. Inside the manor, the air was still and heavy. As she ascended the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the cold banister, she saw a figure waiting. It was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Her posture was as severe as the architecture itself, her silver hair pulled into a tight, judgmental knot. Her pale eyes missed nothing. They followed Serafina's every step, and the small, private warmth she had been cherishing began to cool. Mrs. Gable did not move until Serafina reached the final step. The housekeeper's gaze flickered down to the hem of her dress, where a single piece of straw clung like a tiny accusation. "Lady Serafina," she began, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth, The grounds are extensive. Some areas are more suitable for a lady of your standing than others. The stables, for instance, are the domain of the staff. Serafina's chin lifted, her hand instinctively clutching the silver locket at her throat. It is important to maintain decorum, Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes locking onto Serafina's. Fraternizing with the hired help can lead to unfortunate misunderstandings. It would be unwise. Anger, hot and sharp, cut through Serafina's anxiety. Fraternizing, the word was insulting, clinical. It reduced the quiet understanding she had found with Alec to something improper. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Gable," she replied, her tone matching the housekeeper's for sheer iciness. She stepped around the woman and walked down the long corridor, feeling the housekeeper's gaze like a physical pressure on her back. That night, sleep offered no escape. Serafina tossed in the enormous bed, the silken sheets feeling like shackles. The Duke's face was a featureless shadow in her mind, a monster whose name was whispered with fear. And Mrs. Gable was his guardian, his enforcer, ensuring the prize he had purchased was kept pristine. The thought made her stomach churn. Her defiance smoldered into a quiet, determined fire. The next morning she had a plan. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt monumental. After a solitary breakfast, she made her way to the kitchens. The air here was warm and alive, filled with the scent of baking bread. Acting with a confidence she did not feel, she walked to a wooden bowl of gleaming red apples. Without looking at the startled kitchen maid, Serafina took one. She chose the largest, its skin smooth and cool in her hand. She hid the apple in the folds of her skirt, her heart hammering against her ribs. It felt like stealing a crown jewel. She slipped through a side door used by the gardeners, the heavy oak groaning softly. The path to the stables felt different today. She was not just escaping, she was on a mission. The apple was a secret, a tiny piece of defiance. The scent of hay grew stronger, and the familiar sounds of the horses shuffling in their stalls calmed her racing pulse. She found him in Whisper's stall. Alec was currying the mare's dark coat, his movements slow and rhythmic. He did not seem to notice her at first, his focus entirely on the animal. Whisper stood quietly, her head lowered in trust. Serafina hesitated at the entrance, the stolen apple suddenly feeling heavy in her hand. Then he looked up. His blue eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. He was not surprised to see her. He simply paused his work, his hand resting on the mare's flank. "Good morning, my lady," he said, his voice as low and quiet as ever. Her carefully constructed defiance wavered. In his presence, anger melted away, replaced by a simple yearning to connect. "Good morning, Alec," she replied. She stepped forward, pulling the apple from her skirt. "I brought something for Whisper." She held it out, her hand trembling slightly. Alec looked from the apple to her face, then gave a slight nod toward the horse. Remembering his instructions, she approached the mare slowly, holding the apple flat on her palm. "Hello, beautiful," she whispered. Whisper's ears twitched. The mare turned her magnificent head, her dark, intelligent eyes fixing on the offering. She sniffed at it, her warm breath ghosting over Serafina's skin. Then her soft, velvety lips gently nudged her palm. The mare took the apple with a loud, satisfying crunch. Serafina let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. A wave of pure joy washed over her. She stroked the mare's neck, her fingers sinking into the warm, silky coat. Whisper leaned into the touch. Serafina looked over at Alec, a triumphant, brilliant smile breaking across her face. He did not offer a full smile in return. It was something smaller, more private. The corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly. His eyes, however, were full of a soft, genuine warmth. It was a look of quiet approval, of shared understanding that felt more rewarding than any courtly compliment. "She likes you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It seems so," Serafina replied, her gaze still locked with his. The air between them felt charged, thick with things unsaid. Mrs. Gable's warning seemed a world away. Here, there were no titles. There were only a man, a woman, and a horse. He broke the silence first, turning his attention back to his work. "A horse knows," he said, picking up a soft brush. "They do not care about names or money. They care about what is in your hands and what is in your heart." He did not look at her as he spoke, but she knew the words were for her. Serafina stayed for another hour. She watched him work, asking quiet questions. He showed her how to properly clean a hoof, his large calloused hand gently guiding hers. His touch was brief, professional, but it sent a jolt through her all the same. His skin was rough from work, so different from the soft hands of men in her circle. It was an honest hand. When it was time to leave, a genuine sadness settled in her chest. She did not want to return to the cold silence of the manor. "I should go," she said reluctantly. Alec only nodded, but as she turned to leave, he spoke again. "She will be looking for you tomorrow." Serafina stopped and turned back. His words were a clear invitation, a promise of another day. "I will be here," she said, and the words felt like a vow. As she walked away, the defiance inside her softened into a quiet resolve. She was so lost in her thoughts, she almost missed it. High up in the manor, a curtain in one of the grand windows moved. For a fleeting second, she saw a silhouette standing there. She could not make out the face, but she knew. It was Mrs. Gable. A shiver went down her spine, but it was replaced by a strange empowerment. "Let her watch." A small, determined smile curved her lips. Later that afternoon, a young maid brought tea to her room. The girl was nervous, her hands shaking so much the cup rattled on its saucer. "Is everything all right, Mary?" Serafina asked gently. The girl jumped. "Yes, my lady," she whispered, curtsying quickly. "It is just Mrs. Gable. She is in a mood today. Gave the entire kitchen staff a lecture about waste. Said an apple went missing from the stores." Mary's eyes were wide with fear. Serafina felt a cold knot form in her stomach. It was not about the apple. It was a message sent through a terrified servant, a reminder that no act of defiance went unnoticed. But as the maid scurried out, fear gave way to a reckless amusement. She thought of Whisper's happy crunching, of the quiet, approving look in Alec's eyes. She laughed. It started as a small chuckle, then grew into a genuine, unrestrained laugh that filled the silent, lonely room. From a window across the courtyard, Mrs. Gable stood motionless. She had watched Serafina leave the stables, a lightness in her step that had not been there before. She had seen the silent communication pass between them. Now she watched as the young lady laughed, alone in her room. The housekeeper's face remained a mask of stern neutrality, her expression utterly, completely unreadable. The following day, a strange defiance settled in Serafina's heart. She expected another cold glance from Mrs. Gable at breakfast, but there was nothing. The housekeeper was a ghost, her duties performed with an unnerving efficiency that left no room for interaction. The silence was more unsettling than any warning. Serafina pushed her chair back, the sound scraping against the polished floor, and walked from the suffocating manor. The air in the stables was a welcome balm, smelling of sweet hay and honest work. She saw him immediately. Alec was not just grooming Whisper, but fitting a light saddle onto her back. The mare stood unusually still for him, her dark eyes soft. Serafina's steps faltered. Her heart gave a little trip, a nervous flutter against her ribs. He looked up as she approached, his expression as calm as ever. He simply nodded toward the horse. "She needs to stretch her legs," he said, his voice low, "beyond the paddock." It was not a question, but his eyes held an invitation. For a moment she hesitated. The image of Mrs. Gable's stern face flashed in her mind. This was a line she should not cross. But then she looked at Whisper, who let out a soft nicker, and she looked at Alec, whose calloused hands were so gentle on the powerful animal. This was the only place she felt a whisper of freedom. She gave a small, decisive nod. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. Alec helped her mount Whisper, his hand briefly warm and firm on her arm. The contact sent a jolt through her, a startling current of awareness. He mounted a sturdy gray gelding, then led the way along a narrow path that disappeared into a thick stand of oaks. The world of Blackwood Manor, with its judging windows, vanished behind them. Here, under the canopy of leaves, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth. The only sounds were the soft thud of hooves and the gentle creak of leather. Serafina let Whisper have her head, feeling the mare's powerful muscles move beneath her. For the first time since she had arrived, the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach began to loosen. They rode in a comfortable silence that had become their habit. After what felt like a blissful eternity, the trees began to thin. Alex slowed his horse and turned, waiting for her. "We're here," he said softly. Serafina followed, and as she emerged from the woods, a gasp escaped her lips. Before them lay a hidden meadow, a secret paradise tucked away in the heart of the estate. It was a sea of green, dotted with thousands of wildflowers. A small, clear stream meandered through the center, its surface sparkling in the sun. Alec was watching her, not the meadow. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. He took Whisper's reins and tied both horses loosely to a low-hanging branch. "I thought she would like it here," he said, his gaze returning to the mare. But Serafina knew he had brought her here for her own sake. She slid from Whisper's back and walked slowly toward the stream, her fingers trailing over the tops of the wildflowers. "It's perfect," she breathed. She knelt by the water's edge, watching the current swirl around the pebbles. Here, she was not a duke's property. She was just Serafina. Alec came to stand a few feet away, his presence a solid, reassuring weight. "It is quiet," he agreed, "away from things." She looked up at him. "I used to have a place like this," she said, her voice suddenly wistful. "At home, a garden my mother planted. It had roses that climbed the walls." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, a memory she kept locked away. He sat down on the bank, not too close, but near enough. "It is good to remember places like that," he said, his eyes on the flowing water. "The real places." The way he said real struck her. "And what are the unreal places?" she asked. He picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the stream. "The ones where you have to wear a mask," he answered without looking at her, "where a smile can hide a dagger." His voice was low and carried a surprising bitterness. "Honesty is a rare thing, more valuable than gold." Serafina fell silent. Her entire life had become a mask. The polite nods, the carefully composed face, the very agreement to this marriage. She was living in one of the unreal places he spoke of. Here, with this stable hand, she felt the mask begin to slip. "I think you are right," she whispered, clutching the small silver locket at her throat. It was a nervous habit, a way of holding on to her parents. His gaze flickered to her hand, to the locket, but he did not ask about it. Instead, he pointed to a flash of brilliant blue in the reeds. "Kingfisher," he said. "They only nest where the water is clean." They watched the small, jewel-toned bird dive and emerge with a tiny fish. It was a simple, perfect moment. Serafina felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She found herself telling him more, small, cherished moments that defined her lost world. Alec listened. He simply heard her. And in being heard, she felt a piece of her fractured self begin to mend. As the sun began its slow descent, she turned her head to thank him, but the words died in her throat. He had turned at the same moment. They were closer than she had realized, so close she could see the flecks of darker blue in his irises. Her breath caught. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. All she could hear was the frantic, sudden pounding of her own heart. His gaze dropped to her lips, just for a second, but it sent a wave of heat through her. She saw a flicker of something raw in his expression. It was not the calm of the stable hand. It was longing, pure and undisguised. His hand, which had been resting on the grass, moved. She watched, her pulse hammering, as he lifted it. He was going to touch her. Her own body swayed slightly toward him, an unconscious magnetic pull. Her lips parted, and then it shattered. His hand stopped, hovering for a heart-stopping second. A war played out across his face. The longing was swallowed by a harsh, shuttered look. He clenched his hand into a fist and pulled it back abruptly. He broke eye contact, his jaw tight as he stared at the opposite bank. The air, once thick with possibility, was now painfully sharp with rejection. The suddenness was like a physical blow. Serafina flinched back. Shame and confusion washed over her in a hot, painful tide. What had she been thinking? He was a stable hand. She was the future Duchess of Blackwood. Her cheeks flamed with humiliation. "We should go back," he said, his voice clipped and rough. It was the voice of a stranger. He stood up in one fluid motion, not looking at her, and walked toward the horses. Serafina scrambled to her feet, her fingers trembling. The ride back was an agony of silence. The path that had seemed so beautiful now felt claustrophobic. At the stables, he took Whisper's reins without a word. His fingers brushed against hers, and this time the touch was like ice. He would not meet her eyes. Serafina stood alone in the courtyard as dusk began to bleed across the sky. The warmth of the meadow was gone, leaving a deep, hollow chill in its place. She walked back to the manor like a sleepwalker. In her room, she did not light a lamp. She went to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She saw only his eyes, that brief, unguarded moment of want, and she felt the sting of his retreat. It was more than just humiliation. It was a deep, aching disappointment. In that dark, lonely room, a horrifying realization dawned on her, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. She was falling in love with him. Lady Serafina Covington was hopelessly and impossibly falling in love with a stable hand. The thought did not bring a thrill of forbidden romance. It brought a wave of pure, cold terror. This was a new, more terrible cage, a prison of her own heart's making, with no hope of escape. The days following the ride to the hidden meadow passed in a strange, suspended haze. Serafina moved through the grand, silent rooms of Blackwood Manor like a ghost. She was a body performing the necessary functions of a lady-in-waiting. She ate what was placed before her, she read books without absorbing the words, and she stared out of windows at landscapes she did not truly see. Her real life, the only one that mattered, was lived in stolen moments and vivid memories. Her mind was a constant replay of the meadow, the scent of wildflowers and damp earth, the sound of the stream trickling over smooth stones, the warmth of the sun on her skin. But most of all, she remembered Alec. She remembered the way the light caught the dark strands of his hair. She remembered the quiet intensity in his eyes when he listened to her speak of her home, and she remembered the feeling of his presence beside her, so solid and real it seemed to create its own gravity. Her heart still jolted when she recalled the moment their hands almost touched, the electric space between their fingers that felt more intimate than any actual contact. She was falling for a stable hand. The thought was a constant, terrifying drumbeat in her chest. It was impossible. It was foolish. It was a path to even greater ruin than the one her family already faced. She was promised, sold, to the Duke of Blackwood, a man whose name was spoken in whispers, a man associated with power, ruthlessness, and unimaginable wealth. He was her future, a cold, hard fact. Alec was a dream, a beautiful, painful fantasy she couldn't afford to entertain. Yet every day her feet carried her back to the stables. She told herself it was for Whisper, the spirited mare who now greeted her with a soft nicker. But she knew. She was a moth drawn to a flame, knowing full well she would be burned. One afternoon, the quiet of her gilded cage was broken. A sharp, formal rap echoed from her chamber door. A young footman entered, his face a mask of professional indifference. He carried a small silver tray, and resting upon it was a single, pristine envelope. He bowed stiffly. "A letter for you, my lady, from His Grace." His Grace. The words landed like stones in the silent room. Serafina stared at the envelope. It seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. It was addressed to her, Lady Serafina Covington, in a severe, sharp script. The paper was thick, expensive cream vellum, and holding the flap closed was a disc of dark red wax, stamped with the imposing crest of the Duke of Blackwood. A wolf's head, stark and predatory. For a long moment, she couldn't bring herself to touch it. The footman quoted, his posture unwavering. Finally, she reached out with trembling fingers and took the letter. It felt cold as the marble floors of the manor. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. The footman bowed again and retreated, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a lock turning. She was alone with it, alone with the summons from her owner. Her hand shook so much she had to place the letter on the small writing desk by the window. She sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Her gaze was fixed on the red seal. It was a brand, a mark of ownership. Breaking it felt like a final, irreversible act of surrender. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She squeezed her eyes shut, and an image of Alec's gentle smile flashed behind her eyelids. It gave her a strange, fleeting surge of courage. With a deep breath, she picked up the letter and slid her thumbnail under the wax, breaking the seal with a sharp crack. The note inside was brief. The words were as stark and unforgiving as the crest on the seal. There was no greeting, no preamble, just a command. "I shall be arriving at Blackwood Manor on the evening of the third day from this date. I expect your presence for a formal introduction and dinner. Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood. 3 days. The words swam before her eyes. The air grew thick, pressing in on her from all sides. 3 days until the monster in the stories became the man standing before her. 3 days until her phantom jailer took on flesh and bone. The man who had bought her, who owned her future, was coming. The carefully constructed peace she had found in the stables, the fragile hope she had nurtured in secret, it all began to crumble. A sound, a ragged gasp escaped her lips. The letter slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the floor like a dead leaf. She saw her future laid out before her, a life of cold civility beside a man she did not know and could never love, a life spent in this enormous, echoing house, her every move watched, her every word measured. She would be a duchess, a beautiful ornament to adorn the Duke of Blackwood's arm, and her soul would shrivel and die within these stone walls. The terror was a physical thing. It coiled in her stomach and climbed up her throat, choking her. She clutched the silver locket around her neck, its smooth surface of familiar comfort against her frantic pulse. But even the memory of her parents, of a life where she was loved for herself, brought no solace now. It only highlighted the horror of what was to come. She was being erased. The girl who loved horses and wildflowers, the girl who could laugh in a dusty stable, was about to be extinguished. In her place would be a duchess, a porcelain doll with no heart and no will of her own. And then, through the fog of her fear, came the pain. It was a sharp, piercing agony that had nothing to do with the Duke and everything to do with Alec. The thought of never seeing him again, of their quiet moments being lost forever, was more terrifying than the Duke's arrival. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have allowed herself to feel something for him? To hope. The memory of the meadow returned, no longer a comfort, but a torment. The sunlit peace, his low voice, the unspoken promise that hung in the air between them. It had all been a lie, a beautiful, impossible dream from which she was now being violently shaken awake. She was engaged to be married. He was a stable hand. There was no world where their paths could ever truly cross. That afternoon in the meadow was not a beginning. It was an ending. It was a glimpse of a life she could never have, a happiness that was not meant for her. A sob broke from her, raw and convulsive. Tears she had held back for weeks finally spilled over, hot and blinding. They streamed down her cheeks, a river of grief for a love that was never spoken and a freedom she had already lost. She slid from the chair onto the floor, curling into a small ball on the expensive rug. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight pressing her down. She wept for her lost home. She wept for her ruined family. She wept for the girl she used to be. But most of all, she wept for Alec. She wept for the kindness in his eyes and the calluses on his hands. She wept for the shared silences that were more meaningful than any conversation. She wept for the impossible, heart-stopping feeling of being truly seen by another person. The Duke of Blackwood was a cold shadow, a faceless phantom of duty and dread. Alec was warm and real, the only solid ground she had found in this entire sinking world, and she was losing him. In 3 days, she would belong to another man, and the stable hand with the quiet eyes would become nothing more than a painful memory. The room felt like a tomb. The portraits on the walls seemed to sneer at her, their painted eyes cold and judgmental. The silence of the manor was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, filled with the unspoken condemnation of her station. Mrs. Gable's warning echoed in her mind, fraternizing with the staff. The housekeeper had seen this coming. She had tried to warn her away from the very thing that was now tearing her apart. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't breathe. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. She needed to escape. She needed air. She needed him. A desperate, primal urgency seized her. She didn't think. She only felt. She had to see him. She had to see Alec one more time. She needed to stand in the one place where she didn't feel like Lady Seraphina Covington, the bartered bride. She needed to be in the place where she was just a girl, and he was just a man, and the world outside the stable doors didn't exist. It was an irrational impulse, a flight from a reality she could not bear. But it was the only thing that made sense. Scrambling to her feet, She didn't bother to wipe the tears from her face. She didn't care about her disheveled hair or her red-rimmed eyes. All the poise and pride that had been drilled into her since birth fell away, shattered by raw, unfiltered heartbreak. She ripped open the door to her chamber and fled. She ran. Her slippers made frantic, pattering sounds on the polished wood floors. She flew down the grand, curving staircase, a blur of silk and sorrow. The ancestral portraits of the Beaumont line flashed past, their stern faces a gallery of her future captors. She ignored the startled look of a maid in the hall, her vision narrowed to a single purpose. The heavy oak doors of the main entrance were her gateway. She fumbled with the cold, ornate brass handle, her hands shaking too much to get a firm grip. With a cry of frustration, she threw her whole body against the door, pushing it open just enough to slip through. The cool evening air hit her tear-soaked face, but she barely felt it. She ran across the manicured gravel drive, her thin shoes crunching on the stones. The perfectly sculpted gardens and pristine lawns, meant to impress visitors, were just obstacles in her path. She ran past them, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her heart a wild, painful drum against her ribs. The familiar, earthy scent of hay and horses reached her before she even saw the stables. It was the smell of sanctuary. It was the smell of Alec. The last vestiges of her control broke. Tears streamed freely now, blurring the path ahead. She stumbled toward the rustic stone building, her only beacon in a world that had suddenly gone dark. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, the familiar creak a welcome sound in the storm of her emotions. Inside, the last rays of afternoon sun cut golden shafts through the dusty air. The soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, the gentle rustle of hay, it was all exactly as she remembered. It was peace, it was safety, but she wasn't looking for peace. She was looking for him. Her eyes frantically scanned the familiar space, searching for the quiet figure she knew so well. And then she saw him. He was at the far end of the aisle, brushing down the flank of a chestnut gelding, his movements slow and methodical. His back was to her. He hadn't heard her enter. All she wanted was to be near him, to feel the steady calm that radiated from him, to look at him and forget, just for a moment, the cold letter and the colder future it promised. The man she was forced to marry was a monster. The man before her was her only solace. Desperate and broken, she ran towards him, her heart crying out for the one person in this world who made her feel safe. The cold night air was a shock against her tear-streaked cheeks. Serafina ran, heedless of the sharp gravel that bit at the thin soles of her shoes. The formal letter from the Duke felt like a block of ice pressed against her heart, its cold words seeping into her very bones. He was coming. In 3 days, the monster from the stories, the man who had bought her, would arrive to claim his purchase. Her breath came in ragged sobs, each one a small, tearing sound in the immense quiet of the Blackwood estate. The perfectly manicured gardens blurred into a dark, menacing thicket on either side of the path. Everything here was beautiful, and everything was a lie. The only truth she had found was in the stables. The only person who had looked at her without calculation was Alec. A dim, golden light spilled from the stable's high window, a lone beacon in the oppressive darkness. She pushed against the heavy wooden door, her shoulder protesting the weight. It groaned open, revealing the familiar, comforting world within. The air was thick with the scent of sweet hay, worn leather, and the warm, living presence of horses. A few of them shifted in their stalls, their soft snorts and the rustle of straw the only sounds. For a moment she just stood there, her body trembling, her hand clutching the silver locket at her throat. It was the one piece of her old life she had left, a link to a time when her name meant family, not debt. And then she saw him. Alec was at the far end of the aisle, mending a bridle under the low-hanging glow of a lantern. The light carved his features out of the shadows, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the focused intensity in his eyes. His hands, usually so gentle with the horses, worked with a practiced, steady competence. He hadn't heard her enter. The sight of him, so calm and so real, was almost too much to bear. The careful composure she had tried to maintain shattered completely. A choked sound escaped her lips, a mix of a sob and a gasp. His head snapped up. His blue eyes found her in the dimness, and the focus he held just a second before vanished, replaced by immediate concern. He put the leather strap and tools down on a nearby barrel and moved toward her, his steps quiet on the straw-strewn floor. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space, his expression a question she could not answer with a simple word. His silence was more unnerving than any question. It invited the truth, and the truth was a torrent inside her. "He's coming," she whispered, the words barely audible. Her voice was raw, broken. "The Duke, I received a letter. He will be here in 3 days." Alec did not move. His gaze remained locked on hers, steady and searching. She could see him processing her words, his face a mask of careful neutrality. But she saw a flicker, a brief tightening around his eyes that betrayed something deeper. He said nothing, simply waiting for the rest of the storm to break. "They talk about him in the village, you know," Serafina continued, a bitter laugh escaping her. "And in the letters from my family, they call him ruthless, cold, a man who gets whatever he wants. And he wanted a wife from a good family, a pretty ornament to complete his collection." The words poured out of her, a poison flood she could no longer contain. "My father sold me to him, like a prize horse, like Whisper, to pay for his mistakes." She gestured vaguely around the stable, her hands shaking. "At least the horses are cared for. They aren't expected to share a bed with their owner." The confession was ugly, and a wave of shame washed over her. She was speaking of her future husband to a stable hand. It was improper. It was madness. But the cold formality of the manner had suffocated her, and here in the warm, honest dark, she could finally breathe. She could finally be terrified without judgment. Alec's continued silence was a space she had to fill. "I am a prisoner here," she said, her voice dropping, thick with despair. "This beautiful house is a cage. Every meal, every polite conversation with Mrs. Gable, it's all a performance. I am playing the part of the grateful fiancé, and I feel like a fraud. I feel like I'm slowly disappearing." She looked down at her hands, twisting them together. "I walk through the gardens, and I imagine just running, never stopping. But where would I go? My family's name is ruined. I have nothing. I am nothing without his title, without his money." She finally dared to look up at him again. His expression had changed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something dark and complex. It looked like pain. A deep, furrowed line had appeared between his brows, and a muscle worked in his clenched jaw. He looked as if her words were physical blows striking him one by one. She didn't understand. Why would her misery affect him so? He was just a stable hand. Her fate had nothing to do with his life. "I'm sorry," she stammered, misinterpreting his look as disapproval. "I shouldn't be saying these things to you. It is not your concern." "It is my concern if you are hurting," he said, his voice low and rougher than she had ever heard it. It was the first thing he had said, and the sound of it vibrated through her, his simple declaration of care. So direct and unexpected, broke the last of her restraint. Tears she had been holding back began to stream freely down her face. "I'm so scared," she confessed. The admission, a final surrender. "I lie awake in that enormous, cold bed and I imagine him. This stranger, this man they say has no heart. And I have to let him. I have to become his wife. I have to smile and pretend that my life has not been stolen from me." She paced a few steps away and then back, unable to stand still. "Is it so wrong to want something else? To want a life that is simple? A life where you are seen for who you are, not what you can provide? I dream of a small cottage somewhere with a garden, a place where the silence is peaceful, not heavy." She stopped in front of him again, her eyes pleading. "I wish I could be with someone kind, someone whose hands are not stained with cruel business dealings, but with honest work, someone who knows how to be gentle." Her gaze fell to his hands, the ones she had seen calm a frightened horse, the ones that were now clenched into tight fists at his sides. "Someone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Someone like you." The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with a truth she had not meant to speak so plainly. She had said it. She had confessed the impossible longing of her heart. A flush of heat rose up her neck. She had overstepped a boundary she could never uncross. She expected him to recoil, to step back, to remind her of her place in his. Instead, Alistair felt the world tilt. Her confession was a spear through his carefully constructed disguise. Every word she used to describe the monstrous Duke was a description of the reputation he had painstakingly built. Every word she used to describe the man she wished for was a description of Alec, the man he was pretending to be, the man he secretly wished he could be. She was tearing him in two. He had wanted to test her character, to see if she was different from the grasping, titled women of his world. And she was. She was more real and more wonderful than he had ever imagined. And his test, his stupid, cynical game, was causing her unimaginable pain. He saw the fear in her eyes as she realized what she had said. He saw her bracing for rejection. And in that moment, the Duke of Blackwood and the stable hand Alex ceased to be separate entities. There was only a man standing before a woman he was destroying, a woman he was undeniably falling in love with. He couldn't offer her words. Words were lies. The Duke's words were contracts, and Alex's words were a deception. All he had to offer was a single, true gesture. Slowly, deliberately, he unclenched his fist. He reached out, his arm crossing the small space that separated them. Serafina flinched almost imperceptibly, her eyes wide. She watched his hand as if it were a strange creature, calloused and marked by labor. It was not the hand of a nobleman. It was the hand of the man she had just wished for. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. He gently took her hand in his. The contact was electric. Her skin was cold and trembling. His was rough and overwhelmingly warm. The strength in his grip was not confining, but grounding. It was an anchor in the storm of her fear and sorrow. The warmth seeped into her, a silent current that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. It was a simple touch, a stable hand comforting a distraught lady, yet it felt like so much more. It felt like a promise, a shield. She let out a shuddering breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her tears slowed. She looked from their joined hands up to his face, searching his eyes for the same comfort his touch provided. She found it, but it was buried beneath something else, something she could not name. It was a profound and shattering sorrow. It was not pity, it was a deep, personal anguish, a darkness that mirrored her own, but for reasons she couldn't possibly fathom. It was the look of a man trapped in his own impossible cage. His touch was a silent comfort that feels like a promise, but his eyes were filled with a sorrow she cannot understand. The warmth of his hands still lingered on her skin long after she had fled the stables. It was a ghost of a touch, a faint pressure that was more real than the heavy silk of the gown now being fitted around her. The fabric was the color of a twilight forest, a deep and somber green that swallowed the candlelight. It felt less like a dress for a formal dinner and more like a shroud for a life she was about to bury. Two maids moved around her with practiced efficiency, their movements silent and seamless. They tightened the laces of her corset, pulling until her breath became a shallow, controlled thing. Each tug was a reminder of the constraints closing in on her, the invisible cage of duty and debt. She stared at her reflection in the tall, silver-gilded mirror. A stranger looked back. Her face was pale, her green eyes wide with a terror she could not hide. Her auburn hair, usually a wild escape, had been tamed into an intricate arrangement of twists and pins that felt heavy on her head. This was Lady Serafina Covington, the bartered bride. This was not the girl who had shared an apple with a horse just days ago. This was not the woman who had cried in the arms of a stable hand only hours before. Her fingers went to the simple silver locket at her throat, its cool metal of familiar comfort. Inside were the faces of her parents from a time of love and security. A world Alex seemed to belong to, a world of simple truths and quiet dignity. His eyes haunted her, that deep, inexplicable sorrow he had seen in them as she confessed her fear of the Duke. Why had he looked at her that way? It was not pity, it was something deeper, something shared, a pain that mirrored her own. Her heart ached with a foolish, impossible hope, a hope that his touch, his quiet presence, meant something more, that in this cold, loveless arrangement, she had accidentally found one small, genuine connection. But what good was a connection with a stable hand when her future was sealed with a Duke? He was a dream she would have to wake from. The man she would meet tonight was the reality. A grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour, each resonant bell a hammer blow against her nerves. It was time. One of the maids gave a final, satisfied nod and stepped back. Serafina was ready, ready to be presented like a prize horse at auction. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. She stood, the heavy silk skirt rustling around her ankles. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from across the room. She was an actress about to walk onto a stage, to play a part she had never rehearsed and did not want. She walked out of her room and into the long-shadowed corridor. The air was still and cool, smelling faintly of beeswax and old paper. Ancestral portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following her with stern, aristocratic judgment. Generations of Beaumonts, their faces set in stone, seemed to assess her worthiness. She felt their silent disapproval, a palpable weight in the air. She was a Covington from a fallen house. She was here not for love or lineage, but to settle a debt, a commodity. The grand staircase opened before her, a sweeping curve of dark, polished wood that descended into the cavernous main hall. From the top, the black and white marble tiles below looked like a distant, unforgiving shore. Taking that first step felt like stepping off a cliff. Her hand, trembling slightly, found the cold, carved banister. The wood was smooth and unyielding beneath her palm, so different from the calloused, warm hand that had held hers in the stable. That memory was a spark of warmth in the vast coldness of the manor, a secret she held tight in her chest. She began her descent. Each step was deliberate, measured. The whisper of her dress and the soft click of her slippers were the only sounds in the echoing silence. She remembered other staircases, in other houses, descending towards laughter and music and the promise of a dance. Her heart had been light then, filled with the simple excitement of youth. Now it was a leaden weight in her chest. Each step was taking her further away from the girl she had been and closer to the duchess she was forced to become. She kept her eyes fixed on the marble floor below, unable to look up, unwilling to meet the gaze of the portraits that lined her path. When she reached the final step, she paused, gathering what little courage she had left. The hall was empty, lit by a single massive chandelier whose crystals cast a cold, fractured light across the floor. It felt like standing in a beautiful, ornate tomb. Then a figure detached itself from the shadows near the drawing room. It was Mrs. Gable, her posture as rigid and unbending as ever. The housekeeper stood perfectly still, a sentinel guarding the entrance to Serafina's fate. As Serafina approached, she thought she saw a flicker of something in the older woman's eyes. It was not pity, not exactly. It was a strange, knowing watchfulness that made the fine hairs on Serafina's arms stand on end. Mrs. Gable inclined her head, a movement so slight it was barely perceptible. Her voice was as starched as her uniform, cutting through the silence with formal precision. "My lady?" She did not wait for a reply. "The Duke has arrived. He is waiting for you in the drawing room." The words hung in the air, each one a death knell. The Duke, the monster, the architect of her family's salvation and her personal ruin. He was here. He was just behind those doors. Serafina's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She felt a wave of dizziness, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. She wanted to turn and run, flee back up the stairs, back to her room, back to the stables where the scent of hay and horses felt more like home than this palace ever could. But her feet were rooted to the cold marble. There was no escape. Mrs. Gable moved to the tall, dark wood doors of the drawing room. Her hands grasped the ornate brass handles. With a low groan of old, heavy timber, she pulled them open. A wave of warmth and the scent of wood smoke washed over Serafina. Beyond the doorway, the room was bathed in the golden glow of a roaring fire. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the light. She took a single, hesitant step forward, crossing the threshold from the cold hall into the waiting warmth. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt as though she were stepping into another world. A man was standing with his back to her, one arm resting casually on the grand carved mantelpiece. He was staring down into the flames, seemingly lost in thought. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against the impeccable tailoring of his dark evening coat. Even from behind, he projected an aura of power and effortless command. This was him. This was the Duke of Blackwood. Seraphina's entire body went rigid with dread. She waited for him to turn, to reveal the face of the cold, ruthless man she had been taught to fear. He must have heard the whisper of her dress, because he turned slowly, deliberately. The firelight played across his features, carving his face out of the shadows. For a split second, her mind refused to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. The silhouette was familiar. The set of his jaw was familiar. The dark, unruly hair that even a valet's best efforts could not fully tame was painfully, achingly familiar. Then he was fully facing her, and the light from the fire caught the piercing blue of his eyes. They were the same eyes that had watched her with quiet, unnerving intensity in the stables. The same eyes that had softened with a smile when she had finally earned Whisper's trust. The same eyes that had filled with an ocean of unspoken sorrow when she had confessed her deepest fears into his keeping. The world stopped. The roaring fire, the ticking of the clock on the mantel, the very air in her lungs, it all ceased to exist. There was only the ringing in her ears and the impossible man standing before her. It was Alec. He wore the clothes of a duke, stood with the posture of a duke, and held the title of a duke, but it was him. The rough stable hands' clothes were gone. The faint scent of leather and hay was replaced by expensive cologne. But the man was the same, the man she had fallen in love with, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. The two figures, the two opposing forces in her life, merged into one devastating reality. The gentle confidant and the monstrous captor were the same person. Her mind scrambled to reconcile the two images. The man who had shown her such simple kindness was the very man who had bought her. The safe harbor she had found in this terrifying new world was the very heart of the storm. Every shared silence, every quiet conversation, every gentle touch, it was all recast in a new horrifying light. It wasn't a connection, it was a performance, a lie. Their eyes locked across the vast, opulent room. She saw the guarded mask of the Duke, the stoic expression she had expected. But beneath it, she saw Alec. And in his eyes, she saw not the cold indifference of a stranger, but a raw, desperate apprehension. He looked guilty, pained, almost pleading. He was waiting for her reaction, and he was afraid of it. For a long moment, Seraphina's face was a blank canvas of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her mind was a void. Then the pieces began to click into place, each one a shard of glass in her heart. His sorrowful expression in the stables, Mrs. Gable's knowing looks, his silence when she had spoken of the cruel duke she was forced to marry. He had listened to her bare her soul, knowing he was the man she was describing. He had let her cry over her fate, a fate he himself had orchestrated. The shock in her eyes slowly, glacially, curdled. It hardened into something else. It sharpened into the devastating, soul-shattering sting of betrayal. The world, which had dissolved into a silent, spinning vortex of shock, rushed back with the sharp clink of a silver fork against porcelain. A footman, somewhere at the edge of her vision, cleared his throat. The moment was over. The truth had been revealed. Standing by the fireplace was not Alec, the quiet stable hand. He was Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, her master, her jailer, her future husband. And he was watching her, his face a mask of anxious apprehension. Her body moved without her consent. She felt like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by the cold hand of decorum. She walked toward the grand dining table, her feet sinking into the plush rug. The wood of her chair felt slick and cold as a servant pulled it out for her. She sat. Alistair took his seat at the opposite end of the impossibly long table. The polished expanse of mahogany between them was a chasm, a dark, gleaming river she could never cross. 10 feet of space felt like 1,000 miles. Mrs. Gable gave a curt nod, and the silent, choreographed dance of dinner service began. A clear soup was ladled into a bowl before her. The steam rose, carrying a scent of herbs and broth, but to Seraphina, it was odorless. She picked up her spoon. It felt heavy, a piece of lead in her trembling hand. Her gaze was fixed on the golden liquid, watching her own distorted reflection tremble on its surface. She could not look at him. She could not bear to see Alec's face in the Duke's clothes. "I trust your journey was not too arduous," Alistair said. The voice was the final, devastating blow. It was deeper than she was used to, stripped of the soft, quiet cadence of the stables, encoded in the crisp, commanding tone of aristocracy. Yet underneath it, the timbre was the same. It was the voice that had calmed a nervous mare, the voice that had spoken of honesty in a hidden meadow. Hearing it now, so formal and distant, was a unique form of torture. It was like hearing a beloved song played grotesquely out of tune. Serafina could not form words. Her throat was a knot of unshed tears and burning rage. She managed a small, tight nod. She risked a glance at his hands, resting on the white tablecloth. They were clean, perfectly manicured. The calluses she had felt when he guided her hand to Whisper's muzzle were gone. Or perhaps they were simply hidden, just like the rest of him. The sight made her stomach clench with a sickness so profound she thought she might be ill right there at the Duke's magnificent table. Every moment they had shared replayed in her mind, now tainted and grotesque. His quiet observation of her smile, his approval when she fed Whisper the apple. Their shared silence, which she had mistaken for understanding, must have been his silent judgment. She saw herself in the meadow, her guard down, her heart open. She had confessed her deepest fears about the monstrous Duke of Blackwood directly to his face. The humiliation was a fire licking at her skin. He had watched her, listened to her, and known all along. He had held all the power, and she had been nothing but a fool in his private play. The chefs have prepared a roast they are particularly proud of. He tried again, his voice strained. I hope it is to your liking. The footman cleared the soup bowls and replaced them with plates laden with food. Sliced meat, roasted vegetables, a rich, dark sauce. It looked perfect. It smelled divine. To Serafina, it was ash and dust. She picked up her fork and knife, the silver cool against her hot skin. She pushed a single pea around her plate. The small scraping sound was deafening in the oppressive silence. He fell quiet then, sensing the futility of his efforts. The only sounds were the funereal ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the precise, almost silent movements of the staff. The candlelight flickered across his face. It was the same strong jaw, the same dark, unruly hair that fell across his forehead, the same piercing blue eyes. But the kindness she had seen in them, the quiet empathy, was gone. Or worse, it had never been there at all. It was a reflection of her own desperate hope, a mirage in the desert of her life. Now, in the formal glow of the dining room, his features looked hard, calculating. He was a stranger, a handsome, well-dressed stranger who had stolen a face she loved. She finally lifted her head and forced herself to meet his gaze across the vast table. He looked exhausted. The apprehension in his eyes had deepened into something that looked like genuine pain. He wanted her to understand. He was pleading with her, silently, from across the chasm. But she couldn't build a bridge of forgiveness. Not when he was the one who had set the river of lies flowing between them. All she felt was the cold, rising tide of betrayal. When the excruciating meal finally concluded, Mrs. Gable appeared at the doorway. Coffee will be served in the library, Your Grace. This was her chance. Serafina pushed her chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the marble floor. The sound was a violation, a crack in the perfect, suffocating stillness of the manor. If you will excuse me, she said, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized. I find I am suddenly very tired. She did not look at him. Her focus was on the door, on the escape it represented. She turned and walked, her back straight, her head held high. Each step was a battle. She could feel his eyes on her back. She reached the grand hall, the cool air a relief against her flushed cheeks. Freedom was just a flight of stairs away. Her room, solitude. Serafina. His voice stopped her cold. It was quiet. It was Alec's voice. Stripped of the ducal formality, it was the soft, low tone that had made her feel safe. He did not say Lady Serafina. He said her name as he had said it in the meadow. And it broke her. The fragile dam of her composure, already fractured, shattered completely. She stood frozen for a long moment, her back to him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then slowly she turned. The vast, echoing hall was lit by a single branching candelabra, casting long, dancing shadows. He stood in the doorway of the dining room, a dark silhouette against the light. He had taken a step to follow her. Do not, she began, her voice trembling with a fury that had been simmering beneath the shock. It was low, dangerous. Do not you dare use that voice with me. She started walking toward him, her soft slippers making no sound on the polished floor. It felt as if she were floating across the distance, a ghost haunting the man who had deceived her. The numbness was gone, replaced by a white-hot rage fueled by the deepest hurt she had ever known. What was this all for? She asked, her voice gaining strength as she drew closer. He remained still, watching her approach. Was it an amusing diversion, a little test for the Duke of Blackwood to pass the time? To see if the bankrupt girl whose family you bought was made of suitable material? Her words struck him like physical blows. His face, now visible in the hall's dim light, was pale. He looked stricken. Serafina, it was not a game. She let out a laugh. It was not a sound of humor. It was a sharp, brittle thing full of jagged edges. Not a game, she echoed, her voice rising. You stood in that stable, and you let me pour out my heart to you. I told you I was terrified of marrying a cold, ruthless monster. I told you I was afraid of you. Her voice cracked on the last word. You listened to my deepest fears, all while knowing you were the very man I was describing. What do you call that, Your Grace, if not the cruelest game of all? I wanted to know who you were, he said, his voice low, urgent. He took a step toward her, his hand slightly raised as if in supplication. I wanted to meet the real woman, not the carefully presented lady about to be sold into marriage. I am so tired of the masks, the lies. The lies, she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. She stopped just feet from him, close enough to see the genuine anguish in his eyes, but it did not move her. You dare speak to me of lies? You who'd have crafted a whole person from thin air? I trusted a stable hand named Alec. I trusted his quiet kindness. I trusted his simple honesty. Her voice shook with the memory of that trust, now so bitterly betrayed. But he never existed, did he? He was just a role you were playing, a costume you put on when it suited you. She gestured at his fine clothes, the impeccably tied cravat, the polished shoes. This is you, the Duke, the man with all the power. Then she pointed a trembling finger at her own heart. And I was the fool you practiced your acting on. No, he said, his voice raw. That's not how it was. The man in the stables, that was more me than this has ever been. He reached for her, his fingers brushing her arm. She flinched back as if she had been struck by lightning. The brief touch was a phantom echo of the stables, of his calloused hand over hers. But now it was a brand, a mark of his deceit. Do not touch me, she hissed, the words filled with a cold venom she didn't know she possessed. The pain was so immense it had curdled into pure hatred. She looked him straight in the eye, letting him see the utter devastation he had caused. I thought I was losing my freedom. I thought I was losing my home. I could have borne that. Her voice dropped to a whisper, filled with all the sorrow of her shattered heart. But you made me hope. You made me feel safe. You made me love a man who wasn't real. A single tear finally escaped, tracing a hot path down her cold cheek. And for that, she said, her voice breaking completely, I hate you. The finality of her words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrevocable. She saw his face crumble, the mask of the Duke gone, leaving only the pained, wounded man beneath. For a fleeting second, she saw Alec again, his blue eyes swimming with the same sorrow she had seen in the stables. The sorrow she now understood was his guilt. But knowing its source brought her no peace, only a deeper ache. She couldn't stand to look at him for another second. She turned and ran. She did not walk with dignity. She fled, her beautiful silk gown twisting around her ankles, a gilded cage impeding her escape. She heard him call her name one last time, a desperate, broken sound that echoed in the vast hall. But she did not look back. She raced up the grand staircase, her hand gripping the smooth coal banister. She didn't slow until she reached the heavy oak door of her bedchamber. She burst inside, slamming it shut behind her and leaning against the solid wood, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. The lock clicked into place, a futile gesture. The prison was not the room. It was the man who now owned it, and her with it. The silence of the opulent room pressed in on her. It was a tomb, beautiful and cold. She stumbled toward the large canopy bed, her legs finally giving way beneath her. She collapsed onto the soft velvet coverlet, the carefully constructed facade of Lady Seraphina Covington shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The weeping that came was not for her lost freedom or her forced marriage. She had cried those tears already. This was a new, more terrible grief. She was sobbing for the loss of Alec, for the gentle strength in his hands, for the comfortable silence they shared in the golden, dusty light of the stables. She cried for the man who had shown her how to approach a wild horse, and in doing so had tamed her own wild, fearful heart. She curled into a tight ball, clutching a pillow to her chest as if to hold herself together. Her body shook with the force of her heartbreak. She was mourning a man who had never been. She was grieving for her own foolish heart, which she had given away so completely to a phantom. The ultimate cruelty was not that the stable hand was a duke. It was that her only sanctuary had been a mirage, masterfully crafted by the very storm she was so desperate to escape. Seraphina collapsed onto her bed, sobbing not for her forced marriage, but for the loss of the man she thought she knew. The tears eventually stopped, leaving behind a hollow ache that felt worse than the storm of emotion. Her sobs had been for the loss of Alec, the quiet stable hand, the man she thought she knew, the man who had never existed. Now a suffocating silence filled her room, a silence as cold and vast as the rest of Blackwood Manor. She pushed herself off the crumpled silk of the bedspread, the fine fabric a mockery of her state. Her reflection in the vanity mirror was a stranger, a pale ghost with wild auburn hair and swollen eyes, dressed in an emerald gown that belonged to a duchess-in-waiting. The dress felt like a costume for a play she no longer understood. She had to get out. The walls were closing in. The ancestral portraits on the walls seemed to watch her with smug, knowing eyes. They had seen this all before, a girl bartered, a title secured, a heart broken. She was just another portrait in the making. Her feet moved without conscious thought, carrying her down the servants' staircase, a path she had never taken before. The polished marble of the main hall was too loud, too exposed. Here, in the narrow, dark passage, the air was cool and still. Her hand trailed along the cold stone wall, the rough texture a small, grounding reality in a world that had dissolved into smoke. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she was running from the ghost in the drawing room, the ghost of the Duke of Blackwood, who wore her stable hand's face. Her slippers were silent on the flagstones outside. The night air was sharp, smelling of damp earth and distant rain. The moon was a sliver, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters across the manicured lawns. And then she smelled it, faint but unmistakable, the scent of sweet hay, leather, and horses. Her feet turned toward the stables as if pulled by an invisible string. It was the only place that had felt like a sanctuary. Now she needed to see if it was just another part of the elaborate cage. She needed to stand in the ruin of her own foolish heart and see the lie up close. The heavy stable door was slightly ajar. It groaned softly as she pushed it open. Inside, the darkness was soft and familiar. Shafts of pale moonlight cut through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. The horses shifted in their stalls, their soft snorts and rustles the only sounds. Whisper nickered gently as she approached, her dark head appearing over the stall door. Seraphina reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the mare's soft nose. The horse's warmth was real, solid. Whisper nudged her hand, a simple, uncomplicated gesture of recognition. Here, at least, was one truth, one honest creature. She leaned her forehead against the warm wood of the stall, closing her eyes as a fresh wave of despair washed over her. A floorboard creaked behind her. Her entire body went rigid. She didn't have to turn around. She knew the weight of that footstep. She knew the scent of him, a mixture of the outdoors and something uniquely his own, even underneath the expensive cologne he had worn at dinner. He had followed her. Of course he had. This was his estate. There was nowhere she could run where he could not find her. "Seraphina," he said. His voice was not the clipped, commanding tone of the Duke from the drawing room. It was low, quiet, and rough around the edges. It was Alec's voice. The sound of it was a physical blow, and she flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. "Please," he said, his voice closer now. "Don't run. Not from here. She turned slowly, her hand still resting on Whisper's neck, drawing strength from the animal. He was standing in the center of the aisle, bathed in a stripe of moonlight. He had removed the formal jacket and cravat. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked like a strange, impossible fusion of the two men, the Duke and the stable hand, caught between two worlds. His face was etched with exhaustion and a deep, pleading anguish that mirrored her own. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "Have you come to survey your property? To ensure the new mayor hasn't bolted?" The words were acid on her tongue, but they were all she had. Anger was a shield, and she held it up with all her might. "This place was alarm," she continued, her voice trembling with the effort of holding back tears. "Everything that happened, Hivrim, every word, every silence, it was all a lie, Wag." He took a step forward, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. "No, that's not true." "Isn't it?" she shot back, her voice gaining a sharp, hysterical edge. "You let me believe you were a stable hand. You let me talk to you, trust you. You watched me pour out my heart about how terrified I was of the monster I was being forced to marry. You watched me, knowing you were that monster all along." His face contorted in pain. "I am not a monster." "Then what are you? Why are you?" she cried, finally pulling her hand away from Whisper as if the contact burned. "A man who plays games with a woman's life for his own amusement? A duke so bored he pretends to be a commoner? What was this, Alistair? A test? Did I pass? Did the silly, naive girl prove herself worthy of the great Duke of Blackwood?" "Yes," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the soft rustling of the stables. "It was a test, a foolish, clumsy, desperate test. But the test was not for you, Seraphina. It was for me." He took another slow step, closing the distance between them until only a few feet of dusty air remained. The intensity in his blue eyes was overwhelming. This was the direct, unnerving gaze of Alec, the one that had always made her feel seen. "Do you have any idea what my life is?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "What this title is? It is not a privilege. It is a weight. It is a target." He gestured vaguely back toward the imposing silhouette of the manor. "From the moment I inherited it, I have been surrounded by ghosts and vultures. People who do not see a man. They see an opportunity. They see acres of land, a vault of coin, a name that can open doors. Their smiles are calculations. Their handshakes are contracts. I have had friends betray me for a better offer. I have had women look at me with what I thought was affection, only to hear them later whispering with their mothers about the Blackwood diamonds." His voice was raw with a cynicism so deep it was chilling. Seraphina stood frozen, her anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by a stunned silence. She had seen him as a predator, a powerful duke who held her life in his hands. She had never once considered that he might see himself as the prey. "My father was a trusting man," Alistair continued, his gaze distant, lost in a painful memory. "He was destroyed by that trust, betrayed by those he called his closest allies. They bled his accounts dry and ruined his name for their own gain. I learned from his mistake. I learned to be cold, to be ruthless, to build a wall so high and so forbidding that no one would ever dare try to climb it." He looked at her then, and the pain in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "The Duke of Blackwood, the cold, merciless man you've heard whispers about, that is the wall, Seraphina. It is a mask I put on every morning, a role I play to protect this house, to protect the people who depend on it. It is the most profound lie of my life, and I have grown so tired of wearing it." He stopped, his chest rising and falling heavily. The stable was utterly silent, save for the sound of their breathing. "When our marriage was arranged," he went on, his voice softer now, "I thought it would be more of the same. A transaction, a merger of a title and a name to save a fortune. I expected a woman who would play her part, who would smile for society, wear the jewels, and care for nothing but the status I gave her. I was prepared for that. I was resigned to it." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating motion. "But I was also a coward, and a small, foolish part of me hoped for something else, something real." He gestured to the stable around them. So I came here. This is the only place I have ever felt like myself. Not the Duke, just Alistair, the man who prefers the company of horses to the company of lords. The man whose hands are calloused because he still cleans his own stalls when the day is done. I told Mrs. Gable my plan. She thought I was a fool. She was probably right. I became Alec, and I waited to see what kind of woman my father's debts had bought me. Serafina flinched at the bluntness of his words, the transactional language, a stark reminder of her situation. But he didn't seem to notice, lost in the telling of his own story. And then you came, he said, and his voice changed. It held a note of wonder, of awe. You walked in here so proud and so broken all at once. You didn't fawn. You didn't flatter. You were terrified, but you looked at me as if I were just a man. Annoying, perhaps, in your way, but just a man. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. You were drawn to the most difficult horse in the stable. You were defiant. You stole an apple for her. You came back day after day, not for any gain, but because you found a small piece of peace here. You talked to me, not to the Duke of Blackwood, but to a stable hand you believed had nothing to offer you but a quiet presence. He took the final step, and now he was standing directly in front of her. He didn't reach for her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. That day in the meadow, Serafina, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, you told me about your home, about your fears. You trusted me. You trusted Alec. And in that moment, I knew I was in terrible trouble, because the lie I had created to protect myself had shown me the one truth I had always been searching for. His blue eyes, shining in the dim light, were raw with vulnerability. He was no longer the Duke. He was no longer Alec. He was just a man, stripped bare, his heart in his hands. I fell in love with you, Serafina, he confessed, the words hanging in the air between them, fragile and immense. I fell in love with you in this stable, not as my future duchess, but as the woman with fire in her hair who understood a wild horse. I fell in love with the honesty in your eyes and the courage you showed even when you felt you had none left. My deception was not a game to hurt you. It was a desperate, foolish attempt to find someone who could see past the title. And when I found you, I was too much of a coward to know how to stop the lie. He finally fell silent, his confession complete. He had laid himself bare. The ruthless Duke, the quiet stable hand, they were both him. Two sides of a coin, minted in pain and cynicism. He had offered her the truth, a truth more complicated and painful than the simple lies she had believed. He had not just deceived her, he had shown her the truest part of himself under the guise of a lie, and he had fallen in love with her. Serafina stared at him, the shield of her anger completely gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The image of him from the drawing room, cold and imposing, flickered and merged with the man standing before her now, his soul exposed, his expression pleading. The man she had sobbed for, the kind, stable hand named Alec, hadn't been a complete fabrication. He was here, looking at her from the Duke's eyes. The betrayal was still a sharp, jagged wound in her chest, but now a new feeling bled through it. A confusing, heartbreaking empathy. He was not the monster she had imagined. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own making, a gilded cage just as real as hers. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. What could she say? The man she had grown to love and the man she was forced to marry were the same person. Her sanctuary was his hiding place. Her fairy tale was his lie. He stood before her, waiting for a verdict she did not know how to deliver. Her world had tilted on its axis once tonight, and now it had tilted again, leaving her unmoored, lost in the silence between a devastating truth and an impossible love. She looked at him, truly looked at the pained, lonely man behind the ducal mask and the stable hand's quiet demeanor, and found herself utterly, hopelessly torn. The silence in the stables was a living thing. It was thick with the scent of hay and horse, and the low, mournful confession Alistair had just offered. Serafina stood frozen, the words he had spoken hanging in the dusty air between them. He loved her. He had loved her when she saw him as a simple man, a stable hand named Alec. The revelation did not feel like a victory. It felt like another layer of an impossible knot she could never hope to untangle. Her mind replayed the last few weeks in a dizzying sequence of images. Quiet moments with Alec, his patient hands guiding hers, the terror inspired by the Duke, a cold phantom who owned her future. Now the two men were one, standing before her, his blue eyes pleading. She finally found her voice, but it was a mere whisper, fragile and hoarse. "They say you are ruthless." It was not a question, but an accusation she needed him to hear. "They say you destroyed Lord Ashworth for a minor debt, that you drove his family from their home in the middle of winter." Alistair did not flinch. He held her gaze, his own expression grim. "Lord Ashworth was my father's oldest friend," he said, his voice low and steady, "and he used that friendship to embezzle a fortune from my family's estate after my father passed. He gambled it away, believing I would be too sentimental to demand it back." A muscle tightened in his jaw. The debt was not minor, and his family did not leave in winter. "I gave them until the spring and provided them a cottage on the far side of the county. The story you heard is the one he tells to save his pride." Serafina processed this, the official narrative cracking under the weight of his quiet sincerity. The world of high society was built on such whispers, on reputations crafted from malice and envy. "And Lady Evangeline," she pressed on, her heart aching as she voiced the most painful rumor. "They say you were to marry her, that you cast her aside without a word." For the first time, a deep, profound sadness clouded his features. He looked away toward Whisper, who shifted in her stall as if sensing his distress. "Evangeline, her family saw our union as an acquisition, a merger of two great houses." He let out a slow breath. "She confessed to me 1 week before our wedding that she was in love with another man, a painter with no title and no money. Her family threatened to disown her. She was terrified." He turned back to Serafina, his eyes dark with memory. "So I became the villain. I publicly broke the engagement, citing my own cold feet. I took the scandal onto myself so she could be free to marry the man she loved without her family stopping her. I let the world think me heartless to save her from a life as miserable as the one you feared." Each word was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of her anger, sending ripples of understanding through her. The monster from the stories was dissolving, replaced by a man who used a fearsome reputation as a shield. Not just for himself, but for others. It was a lonely, thankless kind of honor. She thought of the cold, dismissive letter he had sent her. A test. He was testing her, waiting to see if she was like all the others, another opportunist seeking his title. And in her despair, she had run to the stables, to the one person who felt real. She had run to him. Her gaze fell to his hands. They were strong, well-formed, but not the smooth, unmarked hands of a duke who did nothing more strenuous than sign documents. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. She did not take his hand, not yet. She simply laid her fingertips against the back of it, tracing the rough, callous skin over his knuckles. The skin of a man who worked. The skin of a man who had taught her how to groom a horse, how to be patient, how to be still. This was real. This part of him was undeniably, tangibly real. He stood perfectly still, letting her touch him, his breath caught in his chest. He was giving her the space to connect the two identities, to see that the Duke and the stable hand were born of the same flesh, the same heart. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. They blurred his image, turning the lamplight into a soft, hazy glow. "I was falling in love with you," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed grief. "With Alec. He was kind and quiet, and he saw me. He didn't see a title or a debt. He just saw a lonely girl who loved horses." A single tear escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. "When I walked into that drawing room, and I saw you standing there, in his place," her voice broke. "It was like he had died. It felt like you had murdered the only person in the world I thought I could trust." The agony in her voice struck Alistair more than any accusation of cruelty ever could. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, pained. When he opened them, they were filled with a desperate earnestness. "Serafina, no," he said, his voice soft, almost begging. "He didn't die. You have to understand. Alec is not a lie. He is the truest part of me. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small space between them. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, is the mask. He is the fortress I built around myself to survive in a world that only values power and wealth, a world that betrayed my father and tried to use me. He gestured around the stable, at the warm wood and the scent of hay. This is my only refuge. Working with the horses, the honesty of it, that is where I feel like myself. I called myself Alec because it was my father's middle name. It was the name he used when he would sneak down here to teach me to ride long before he was a duke. His own voice grew thick with emotion. I never let anyone else see that man. Not my friends, not my household, no one, because they all wanted something from the duke. He looked at her, his soul bare in his eyes. But you didn't want anything. You just wanted a friend. You walked into this stable and you saw a man, not a title. You gave him a reason to exist again. Alec is not dead, Serafina. He is standing right in front of you, and he is more real than he has been in 10 years, all because of you. The sincerity of his confession was overwhelming. It was a truth so raw and vulnerable, it disarmed her completely. The anger, the sense of betrayal, it all began to melt away, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. He was just as trapped as she was, but his prison was one of his own making, built to protect a soft heart in a hard world. She was the only person he had ever given the key. Another tear slipped down her face, a tear not of grief now, but of a profound, painful understanding. He saw it fall. Very slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal, he raised his hand, the same calloused hand she had just touched. He gently, so gently, brushed the tear from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. The touch was warm, a spark against her cold skin. It was the touch of the stable hand, familiar and comforting. It was the touch of the Duke, careful and respectful. It was his touch, and this time she didn't pull away. The weeks after their confession passed in a quiet understanding. They rebuilt what was broken with shared morning tea and long, silent walks. He learned the rhythm of her moods. She learned to see Alec, the stable hand, in the Duke's thoughtful gaze. The foundation they laid was fragile, but it was real. Weeks later, the chapel air was thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax. Sunlight fractured by stained glass painted the stone floor. Serafina stood at the entrance, her hand on her father's arm. Months ago, she had imagined this moment with pure dread. She expected her heart to feel like a stone. Instead, it fluttered, a wild bird beating against her ribs. Her fear was gone, replaced by a dizzying hope that felt far more dangerous. Her eyes found him at the altar. Alistair, he was no longer the cruel duke of her nightmares, nor simply Alec. He was both. As she walked down the aisle, his stoic mask dissolved. His gaze locked on hers, and in his blue eyes she saw an aching vulnerability meant only for her. The ceremony was a performance for the assembled lords and ladies. They spoke the ancient, formal vows, their voices echoing. The words were about duty, alliance, and legacy. But before the final pronouncements, Alistair leaned in. His voice was a low murmur, lost to everyone but her. "They see a duchess," he whispered. "I see the girl who tamed a wild horse with a stolen apple. I promise to spend my life seeing that girl." Tears blurred Serafina's vision. She found his hand, his familiar fingers wrapping around her own. "They see a duke," she whispered back, her voice thick. "I see the man who taught me honesty is worth more than any title. I promise to always look for him." He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement that their true vows had just been made. The rest of the ceremony was a dream. The grand reception was a blur of music and polite conversation. Serafina played the part of the new Duchess of Blackwood, but she kept catching Alistair's eye across the ballroom. He would give her a small nod, a secret shared in public. It was a look that said, "This is for them. What is for us comes later." 2 days later, the silks and jewels were gone. Serafina stood in the stable yard in simple riding breeches. Alistair emerged from the stables in worn boots, leading 2 horses, his stallion and her mare Whisper. He helped her mount, his hands firm at her waist. For a moment, they were just as they had been. "Are you ready, Your Grace?" he asked, a playful glint in his eyes. She laughed, a sound that was bright and free. "Only if you can keep up, my lord." With a shared grin, they urged their horses into a canter, leaving the manor behind. They galloped across open fields, the wind whipping her hair from its braid. Laughter pealed from her lips, a sound of pure release. He led her to their hidden meadow, now a riot of wildflowers. They slowed their horses to a walk. "The last time I was here," Serafina said softly, "I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff." Alistair reined in his horse beside hers. "You were," he answered, his voice serious, "and you were brave enough not to step back." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was sure. "I was terrified," she confessed. "I know," he said. "That is what makes it bravery." They dismounted, letting the horses graze. The world fell away. He closed the small space between them, his hands on her waist. She leaned into his touch, her hands finding the steady beat of his heart. "I fell in love with a stubborn, fierce woman in a stable," he said, his voice low. "A woman who saw value in a man with dirt under his nails. I never want to lose her." "You never will," Serafina promised, her fingers curling into his shirt. "And I fell in love with a quiet, gentle man who spoke to horses. He is the man I married." Alistair lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes, so often guarded, were wide open with a love that stole her breath. When he kissed her, it was not the chaste, formal kiss from the altar. It was a kiss of homecoming, filled with unspoken words and shared pain. They were not a duke and duchess bound by a contract. They were Alistair and Serafina, who had been lost and had finally found their way home.